just war tradition. What is it and where did it come from?
It is a tradition rooted in biblical and Christian theological principles that we see in the Bible. Leaders have a responsibility to protect the people under their care from criminals, from lawbreakers, and to protect from foreign enemies.
So when we're talking about, let's say, willing the good of the other and wanting the best for our neighbor, how do we reconcile that when our neighbor is our enemy and wishes us harm?
We're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. How do I love myself? We love him as created by God, that he has dignity, and yet we recognize that he may do things that are sinful, illegal, unlawful, immoral. We may have to stop him. We may have to put him in jail. We may have to fight against him to stop his evil. We may have to kill him. But we're recognizing in humility, he's one of us in that sense.
Today we're sitting down with one of our era's leading thinkers at the intersection of ethics, faith, and national security. Dr. Eric Patterson, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So Dr. Patterson, I think, brings a rare credibility, not just through his scholarship and his research and his writing, but through his public service and his institutional leadership. He served as a White House Fellow, worked in the U.S. State Department, Bureau of Political and Military Affairs, and has spent over 20 years as an Air National Guard commander. On the academic side, he has deep experience practically and research-wise, and right now he's leading the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation as president and CEO, and previously headed the Religious Freedom Institute. He's written and edited over 20 books. Some of the most relevant ones for our conversation today include A Basic Guide to the Just War Tradition, Christian Foundations and Practices, Just War and Christian Traditions, and these titles are available. Just Google it. You can go to Amazon or academic publishers, and you can take a look for yourself. I'm Mike Arnold. I'm the founder of Born Defense. At Born Defense, our mission is to end the forever wars by investing with a moral clarity informed by just war tradition. And that's why we've brought you here today, Dr. Patterson, to educate us a little bit and our listeners. So thank you for coming, and I'd be happy to hear a little more about your background and experience and talk about these issues that really matter to me and our listeners.
Well, Mike, thanks for having me. And your mission is very appropriate in the times in which we live. You know, I came to an interest in these things, like many, many Americans, proud of my country, patriotic, asking questions about, when we think about international life in particular, about order and justice and security and how to define peace. I was very proud of our past, the greatest generation fighting World War II, my father's generation trying to help save and help the people of Vietnam defend themselves against communist tyranny, all the way back to George Washington. And so these questions and the moral questions that are a part of that. What's also been very interesting to me was my work in the reserves was always trying to tell the story about the U.S. military. I wasn't a frontline fighter. My work as an academic led me to about 2.5 years doing arms control work at the State Department. And it made me think a lot about, in late and in post-conflict, what are the steps we have to take to kind of sew it up so we don't have an outbreak of war again. And so all of those things have made me very, very interested in the practical side of how do you bring conflict to an end that will endure, and what are the moral underpinnings of going to war in the first place, of defense, of how war is fought, and then a moral ending to war that leads to an enduring peace.
Well, I hate to put the cart before the horse here, but let's kind of jump to the end. So what do you mean by a moral ending to war?
So much of the just war tradition, and it would be better for us to call it just statecraft, but the term just war has lasted. But by just statecraft, what I mean is political authorities are making decisions at all times about order, justice, security, about the terms of peace for their publics. That's the primary social contract, and we want it to be moral. We want it to be ethical, hence just statecraft. When we're talking about late and post-conflict, though, so much attention in the past was given to the decision to go to war and how war was fought. And then we just assumed, well, I guess everybody just goes home. And the reality is that we actually have baked into the statecraft tradition some principles about how to think about how war ends. And here's three overarching principles that we could talk about. The first is order. You have to stop the bullets flying. And then the second is justice, thinking about what are the claims both by the aggrieved and against the aggressors. And how do you adjudicate that? And then the third, and over time, you're trying to move from order to, frankly, limited justice and towards conciliation, towards a time when former adversaries could at least imagine living as neighbors, maybe not kumbaya, but just living as neighbors on the same planet. And so thinking order, justice, secure, and then this towards conciliation, it's a useful framework for us thinking about a moral end to war.
So that just statecraft notion, the just war tradition, what is it and where did it come from? How did it develop?
Yeah, so this is a tradition that goes back in kind of the natural law tradition to Greco-Roman thought. And it's a tradition rooted in biblical and Christian theological principles that we see in the Bible. And if you want to, what we'd say is leaders have a responsibility to protect the people under their care, first and foremost. And what is developed from that, and we see that in the Old Testament, Nehemiah, David, Joshua, Daniel. In other words, people whose vocation, they have a calling to public service, to protect and to defend, to serve the common good, to protect from criminals, from lawbreakers, and to protect from foreign enemies. We see this in the New Testament as well, most importantly in Romans 13. But we see that John the Baptist, Jesus, and others, they never said that law enforcement or government service or the armed services, that these are illicit vocations. In fact, their interactions are always positive for the most part with people who are in those public service vocations. And so what's developed over time is a tradition that we associate with Augustine and Aquinas and many great Christians through the Reformation up to today that starts by asking the question, so what is the way that authorities, proper government authorities, should think about the use of force? And that begins with authorities making decisions based on just cause and right intention. And this whole just statecraft kind of approach to things, this whole just war, begins actually with those questions. When we're thinking about the use of force, who is the authority and how are they deciding based on just cause and right intention?
All right, so how would we define just cause, and how would we go about determining if something is first a cause and if it's just?
Let me give you a very quick mental image for our viewers. Think about the difference between two of the Skywalkers, Darth Vader, Anakin Skywalker, and his son Luke Skywalker. Now you intuitively know there's something different between these two. And in a sense, as Jedis, they are representative knights of the empire, if you will. So authority, appropriate government, whether it's over law enforcement, the magistrates, the judges, the penal system, the law, and the military, government should be controlling the use of force. Outside of the appropriate governing body, it's just violence. And by violence, I mean it's destructive, it's lawless, it is outside of proper authority, or it oversteps its bounds, such as there's a difference, for instance, between police use of force, even lethal force, and what we might call police brutality, over the line, right? So Augustine said just cause was things like, in addition to self-defense, righting a past wrong, restoring something that was taken, punishing wrongdoers. Those are all justice and security things, aren't they? And then right intention. And this is a great contribution of Christianity to thinking on these matters. What is in the heart? Is the goal of the use of force towards justice and restoration? Or is it based on vengeance, hatred, bitter wrath, a destructive spirit? So force can be used by authorities on a just cause with an intention of neighbor love, or it can be used in a way that seeks to destroy, that's based on hatred and things. And think about the difference between Luke and Darth Vader. The good side of the force, Luke put himself under authority, and remember at the end of one of those movies, The Empire Strikes Back, he refuses to kill his father. He refuses to give in to hate. The emperor says, I can feel the hate in your heart, give in to the dark side. Luke famously says no, turns off his lightsaber, because in his heart he's refusing to give in to that type of hatred.
Well, I
What
mean,
is your yeah.
in hindsight, that decision worked out, but wouldn't it have been a just cause to decapitate the leader of an enemy if presented with that opportunity, as Luke was in the presence of the Emperor and Darth Vader?
That is correct. So there could be a just cause for action, but what Luke shows us is a motivation and how important it is. And so we have a role to play. Our political authorities, our society has a major role to play to help our young men and women in the armed services. I mean, this is the practical side. Understand what they're fighting for: defense of our country, defense of our comrades, pursuit of justice, crushing evil, stopping the guys like ISIS, the guys like Al Qaeda, pirates on the Somali coast, etc. But helping them to understand that they will quench their soul if we focus their attention on dehumanizing the enemy, hating the enemy, wanting to that kind of rapacious, wrathful bitterness. There really is a difference there, and it really matters on how we train and prepare, not just physically, but the minds and hearts of our soldiers and other armed forces personnel.
What would you say to someone who's thinking about the military that maybe has not received adequate virtue or theological formation in their own lives? Maybe they don't know the definition of what justice is or what it means to be a man and make just decisions.
Well, we do have a problem, and it's a problem that the military has been saying publicly for at least 15 years, a deep concern that many of the young men and women who join the armed forces are not spiritually, morally, ethically prepared because we have a society that has jettisoned a common set of Judeo-Christian principles that undergird what it means to be first a good and patriotic citizen, seeking the common good, doing the right thing. And then when they get into uniform, the military is having to start from scratch to try to rebuild those virtues. The good news is that because kind of our civilizational values are rooted in these fundamental virtues, things like justice, that all of our branches of service actually have core values that are attuned to those. Things like the Air Force: integrity, service, and excellence. Those are the 3 Air Force core values. And so one of the ways that we try to instill this in young people in the US is that in their training, not just treat them how to survive, not just treat them how to shoot, not just treat them how to live under austere conditions, but on the one hand, these are our core values. This is what it means to be an American. This is what it means to be an airman or a Marine or a soldier or a sailor. And then tying that to kind of, what's very important is tie that to the bigger American story, the story of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, the meaning of the Constitution. You can see how it's very important for us to push against the deconstructivist type of society that we've lived in the 21st century and say, no, you, the young soldier, you're tied to, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain fundamental rights. And we start with that, and we train them in the core values. Now, I do wish that there was even greater spiritual and religious formation for them. But that's how that's how in the current time that we get at some of these things, and you can see how important these linkages are.
What would you tell a young person that's getting involved in business or getting involved in the military or just curious about these ethical frameworks? Like what is the meaning of justice? We talk about just war, but we haven't talked about what justice is. Because I mean, I hear a lot in the news and popular culture about certain adjectives in justice, about certain identity politics that may overlay a view of social justice or economic justice. We say all these truths are self-evident, but what is the core truth of what justice is?
Yeah, and because we're speaking in a Christian frame of reference, I want to start with a statement really about justice in terms of its most humble way. We often talk about justice as getting one's just deserts or getting what one deserves. And that can seem like a very emancipated, a very elaborate, a very massive way of making claims. But I think that the biblical way to start is to say, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, including me. And so it's to start with a humility that actually not with huge claims, but to start with a recognition of the fallenness and the brokenness of the world that we live in, and a humility that all of us have made mistakes. And so out of compassionate love for our neighbor, love of neighbor as we would love ourselves, recognizing God's potential in every person, but also our limitations and fallenness, that helps us to be thinking in the right way towards justice. Not as me. That's the way we think about justice these days, right? We think about justice as different sectors of society or individuals making these big claims on the rest of us, or me making big claims. What if we started with, wow, we're all fallen, we're all limited, we live in fallen, broken societies, and yet we're very, very fortunate in a place like the United States that by starting with those principles and yet recognizing the inherent dignity of every person, that we start there with kind of a limited framework. And then what we look for, where we go from there, is we say, okay, how do we build that just and rightly ordered society in a way that recognizes human limitations? That's why we need law enforcement. That's why we need the military to help protect us. That's why we need the law. That's why we need the courts. And at the same time, respects the dignity of people. In other words, we say, my neighbor has worth, and the guy in the town 100 miles away from me has worth. And citizens all around the world, even if they don't look like I do, even if they don't think like I do, even if they don't worship like I do, they are human. They're of equal worth. And so those are those first steps, I think, towards thinking about just statecraft. Doesn't mean that we have to fix everything in the world, but it's starting with a realistic portrait of human dignity and human frailty, which means we need government, we need self-defense, we need guardians who will serve in law enforcement and the military so that we can be working towards the common good.
So when we're talking about, let's say, willing the good of the other and wanting the best for our neighbor,
Yeah.
how do we reconcile that when our neighbor is our enemy and wishes us harm? Like how does just statecraft deal with that?
Yeah. So, C.S. Lewis has a lot to say about this. He has a piece called Learning in Wartime and another piece called Why I'm Not a Pacifist. And one of the arguments he makes actually has to do with how do I love my neighbor as myself? And again, it starts with a level of humility. And this is what Lewis says. Okay, we're supposed to love our neighbor as ourselves. How do I love myself? Well, when I look in the mirror, I know that guy in the mirror has some pretty big sins. And at times, he deserves justice. In fact, I look at that guy in the mirror sometimes, and although I love him, I really don't like him. I don't like what he's done. I don't like what he's thought. I don't like that guy. In fact, I know he's evil. And Lewis says, that type of realistic view of our neighbor, we love him as created by God, that he has dignity, and yet we recognize that he may do things that are sinful, illegal, unlawful, immoral. We may have to stop him. We may have to put him in jail. We may have to fight against him, to stop his evil. We may have to kill him. But we're recognizing in humility, he's one of us in that sense. And you know what, if we can be helping our young people know, they're fighting against evil actions. They are protecting their fellow citizens. They're protecting their country. And we may have to kill to stop evil, to stop the evil being done. But that is a virtuous act if we're stopping evil.
Well, and let's put ourselves in the shoes of an enemy combatant that may be following the orders or a particular unjust statecraft. Like how do those folks personally reconcile that with their purpose and their mission, assuming that we're talking they're shooting at the enemy, not shooting at civilians, but following the orders of an unjust statecraft leader, or maybe a state deconstructionist, to put it into the opposing terms.
Well, let's think about just the context of American wars for the past 25 years. The vast majority of the deployments of American personnel and the fights that they've had have been with people who their organizations are in most cases against international law, against kind of a common good approach to the international space. They are in a sense illegitimate combatants. I'm talking about Al Qaeda, who massacre civilians. I'm talking about the terrorist groups that are closer to Israel, like Hamas and Hezbollah. I'm talking about the Houthis in Yemen. I'm talking about these highly militarized drug cartels in Central and South America that have their own planes and miniature submarines for moving drugs around, and that have caused chaos in places like Haiti and Venezuela and others. The list goes on, but in almost every case, what we're talking about is coordinated, cooperative efforts that that first attack their own neighbors. ISIS attacks its own neighbors. Al Qaeda attacks its own neighbors. Right. In other words, they're a threat to those closest to them, and then they've expanded their reach of violence and destruction. The people who are part of those, they are perfectly legitimate targets. They're perfectly legitimate combatants for U.S. and Western military forces to take on directly to stop the illegal and the immoral activity.
So just in the news recently was a pretty uncanny video of a Venezuelan boat that was said to be part of cartel efforts, where a kinetic strike was done recently. Um, how would just statecraft apply to that?
Yeah. So think about the United States as first, remember, if it comes to humanitarian supplies, if it comes to economic help or any of those things, everyone's begging the U.S. to pay, right? So in the security sphere, if people often want the U.S. military to help them at certain times, but not at others, but the reality is that the U.S. should be, as a major power and a major Caribbean and Atlantic and Pacific power, it should be a good neighbor. It should be a force for constructive dialogue for the rule of law. It should be against pirates. It should be against human trafficking, right? It should be against violence, etc., in its neighborhood. And it's not very far from, say, Florida and Puerto Rico down to Venezuela and our neighbor Mexico, etc. And think about all the U.S. citizens and businesses that we have working across the region, making money, helping people have a lifestyle, sending kids to school and things. In the Venezuelan case, you have a regime that last July of 2024, lost the election by over 70% of the vote. And we have the paper ballots and the computer trail to prove it. This is a rogue regime that violates international law, that openly works with criminal cartels, drug cartels, and militias. It has used those types of militias in at least 3 countries abroad to do assassinations, to do drug running, etc. And so the U.S., in a sense, it hasn't sent a military there. It hasn't invaded the country. It's done sanctions. It's done a variety of diplomatic actions. And it has acted at times against, say, drug boats or these types of things out on the seas. And it's perfectly justified if you think about upholding the rule of law in the region.
I want to kind of shift focus to folks that may be in the investment public that are maybe sitting on the sidelines over the past few years in their investing career, and haven't wanted to put money into deals that fed the war regime, that fed the military-industrial complex for moral reasons. They don't want to be involved in the perpetual wars. Like what can businesses do to align themselves either through investments or where they send their products and services, even if a regime may be an ally of ours? How can an ethical framework like just war tradition or just statecraft be employed into business practices?
Well, this is a very important set of questions because we're a democracy. We believe in limited government. And by limited government, what we mean is we're expecting citizens and groups of citizens, whether it's in the social sector, meaning nonprofit organizations, or in the corporate sector, businesses, or in the education sector, universities, we're expecting them to, the way of a free society is people choosing to act morally, right? And so this is a profound question. And it's a question that involves rightful patriotism, not xenophobic hypernationalism, but rightful patriotism, and a contribution that scientists and businessmen can make towards national defense. Less loss of life, better surveillance of the enemy, better, quicker actions, the protection. So there's a lot here, but a simple way of thinking about this is part of the just war tradition is a second question. The first question, when is it just to employ force? The second, what is the morality of how war is fought or how force is employed? So once the decision is made, and that is bounded by the principle of military necessity, taking actions where you're trying to win appropriately, which is a stewardship principle. The second is the idea of proportionality. We shouldn't be any more destructive than necessary. We want to limit destruction. And third, the idea of distinction. We can distinguish or discriminate between things that should be off limits, non-combatants, private homes, houses of worship, libraries, hospitals, etc. We can distinguish those from appropriate military targets. There's a difference between a civilian and a lawful combatant. There's a difference between a military base and a private hospital, etc. And so businesses can start by thinking, as we get involved, as we're investing, as we are creating things, are we creating things that fall within these categories of, will they be proportional in their appropriate use if they're used appropriately? Are they in the hands of a government that acts with proportionality and discrimination? In other words, you could sell a very, very dangerous weapon to the United States government and have a level of trust that they're going to operate by the laws of armed conflict. But you ought not to sell that weapon to Vladimir Putin and the current regime in Moscow. Or it may not be wise. There should be a limit. You don't want to sell that weapon to the former Assad regime in Syria. You don't want to sell it to Hezbollah. In other words, you don't want to just sell to the highest bidder. Businesses can make decisions about where they invest, what they make available, who they make it available to. And of course, there is some limit, of course, on the use of their technologies. I think about, for instance, companies that were complicit in creating the crematoria and the gas chambers that extinguished so many Jewish lives during the Holocaust and World War II. These were corporations, and they knew what was going on. At least some of their technicians, some of their scientists, and some of their business owners, they knew. They crossed a line. It's perfectly fine to make some of those things for their appropriate use. They should not, even to the point of having to shut down their business, even having to go to jail, etc. Businessmen have a moral conscience. They have a responsibility in society to not aid in the creation of illicit harms.
When I think in terms of voting for a leader, and you vote for lesser evil a lot of times. We're never really offered a chance to vote for choices between two saints, but we've got to make some decisions about who's going to have do the least amount of harm, or at least have the maximum impact on the areas that we deem just. But I think about it in terms of also investment is like that too. So I can make an impact by voting at the ballot box. I'm here in Oregon. Maybe my vote doesn't matter as much, when it's coupled against the way our state leans. But I can also vote with my pocketbook, and I can vote where I spend my time and where I spend my money. And I think about that in terms of shareholders and shareholder corporate accountability and transparency, and what sort of transparent efforts can a business put in place to make sure that they're at the governance level. Obviously, following U.S. law is easy to some respects. There's people we can or can't sell to, but when it comes to the murkier areas on selling to our allies that may be involved in an unjust conflict, like what are some corporate governance techniques that can be used, and ultimately, how can you be as transparent as possible so the shareholders can have a voice in complaining about a press release that might come out about how we're deploying new technology or who we're selling this technology to?
So let me say something briefly about kind of the superstructure of law that we Americans have helped to create to put some limits there. But then second, obviously there's some corporate governance aspects where people have to make decisions. So one of the things that has happened based on this just war tradition is that over the past 150 years, it's gone from philosophy and from theology into a very practical set of laws, what we call the War Convention or the Law of Armed Conflict and international humanitarian law. It goes all the way back to, for instance, the code of conduct for the U.S. military, what's often called the Lieber Code from the Civil War, and that spread actually throughout Europe by the end of the 19th century. There was also a set of laws limiting the destructiveness of weapons, the first one being the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration, and it had to do with certain types of exploding bullets to limit them. And throughout the 20th century, we banned, it didn't stop them always being used, but we came to ban biological weapons and chemical weapons. We created a nuclear non-proliferation treaty designed to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons. There's a conventional weapons convention that the United States is a leader on. I could go on, but what's important in this is the U.S., led by leaders who were democratically elected, has been a leader in bringing international consensus towards the Geneva Conventions, towards the Hague Conventions, towards the Torture Convention, in an effort to create a body of law that embraces these kind of fundamental values. Note that it wasn't top down. Note that it was a democratic country through our processes in electing people to represent us, and then our government agencies being the ones to create this rule structure for international life, including limits on what are called dual-use technologies, something that can be used both in the kitchen and in a bomb. So that's the superstructure. That's important. A lot of us don't always see it, and it comes from these older just war restraints. But that doesn't stop corporations from having to make their own decisions about the paths of research that they're going to take, the types of weapons that they're going to create, the ways that they will try to buy or sell things on the international market, the relationships that some corporations might have illicitly or through a third party with bad actors. I would say just a really bad story from Europe in the 80s and the 90s is the way that technologies ended up in the hands of Saddam Hussein and in Pakistan, so that Pakistan, for instance, could create a nuclear weapon. And it was European technologies and the story through North Korea and Pakistan and things. Uh, you know, Companies were complicit. They chose to look the other way, and so there really is we want to have moral leaders in corporations. We want to have real corporate governance to stop that from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think of in terms of project management. You could have as best software as you can for managing a project, but it really comes down to the people you have in place, the leaders that are, and the taskmasters and the people employing the tasks. You got to have you guess you need just men to employ, just war and employ whatever sensible governing practices that a company may need to achieve those just results. And so I always harken back to the comment that sunlight's the best disinfectant. And if to the extent that there's a lot of secrets involved in national security, and it's easy to hide a lot of the deal flow that may be going through to certain countries. But overall, if you can have a public company, like a publicly traded company that is already required to be transparent to investors to the extent the law allows and the extent that non-disclosure agreements can permit. What about transparency that can at least allow alarm bells to be raised and for ethics committees to at least give a dissenting voice when a deal may be very tempting? How would you recommend employing that into corporate governance into practices?
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about in a sense is just statecraft in a sense, right? So what we're talking about is first of all the larger society oriented towards pursuing right ends of justice and peace, a sense within a democratic society about the rule of law, and And our principles, the way in a fallen world that we do that is through checks and balances, through accountability, through certain types of disclosures to different governing agencies, and to corporate governance. These are all actually wonderful and important things. Why do we have them? We have them because way down deep inside, we know that we need to have limits on we need to have checks and balances because of human fallenness. And so these are perfectly appropriate. I think that the biggest thing is that companies that have a mission and that live up to the mission that is something other than only profit. By the way, there's nothing wrong with profit, right? Profit allows us to reinvest. It allows us to pay our employees. It allows us to diversify. It allows us to invest. So there's nothing wrong with profit. But profitability cannot be, for its own sake, cannot be the only criteria for success. And by the way, most of the businessmen I know, that they're captured by innovation. They're captured by contributing to the common good. They're captured by technological change. They're captured by patriotism of wanting to help their country. They love paying their employees well. So many of the successful, the kind of jaded Hollywood movie type of big fat tycoon. That's not really what most leaders in innovation in industry are like. Although we do have to always kind of be concerned about both ego and greed in these moments, right? But that's why we have corporate governance. So really focused on what our mission is. What is our end? It's contributing to, in the defense sector, in the private defense sector, it's contributing to national defense. It's helping our government protect our own citizens, right? It's helping our government stop evil doing from happening abroad. And if that's the way we're thinking about our mission in terms of guardianship, protectorship, that's the way to get at this.
And so, just talking about war versus peace and deterrence, how can you have deterrent effect by peace through strength? Like how can preparing for the worst case scenario be a just in and of itself?
Yeah. So for one thing, it's worth remembering that there really are two different types of peace. And Augustine said there's a difference between a just peace and an iniquitous peace. And it's worth kind of just putting a tab or a marker down to say, the Soviets wanted to impose their form of peace, and it was not a just peace. It was a peace based on almost 500 concentration camps or gulags, right? The Nazis had a version of peace, and the Nazi version of peace was racial superiority and no Jews around. So there are iniquitous or unjust forms of kind of a totalitarian peace. That is not a just peace, a rightly ordered peace, a peace that's devoted towards the common good, that's devoted towards justice for the individuals who are part of society. So that's an important way of thinking. When we think about this concept of peace through strength, it's not the unjust peace that we're trying to contribute to or control. It is that what we're trying to do is we're trying to protect, we're trying to defend, we're trying to guard, we're trying to preserve society so that it can be working, every day towards what it means to have a just peace at home and in our neighborhood. And so I think that's at the core of thinking about this. Deterrence is very, very important. Deterrence is not a bad thing. Having a strong and robust military that's well trained, well prepared, well equipped, and has demonstrated its acumen, that is a big deterrent. It's like putting locks on your doors. It's like putting an alarm on your car. It's like putting policemen on the streets. We're told that the sight of a policeman, the sight of a police car, is the number one deterrent to crime, a crime against a church, crime against a school, crime against a corporate building. Deterrence works. It is preserving the peace.
How do we reconcile that, knowing that some bad actors won't do bad things because good people are watching them? And how do you reconcile that with a free society that doesn't want to be watched every second of the day? Like
That's a very important point. Is not slipping down the slope of of ubiquitous forms of surveillance, not having a large police state, et cetera. And of course, we know that the first and foremost thing, as you brought up earlier, is the formation of virtuous citizens. Back to the founding fathers in the first generation, Madison and others, de Tocqueville and others commenting on American society in the second generation. They said, there's two ways to control society. Either you can have free society where men and women make right decisions because they want to, they live under the law, or you have to control everybody. And the totalitarian state controls people, dictates what they can and can't do at all times. So the first and foremost thing is the work that we can be done in our churches, our schools, our families, in civil society more broadly, against the backdrop of a limited government, but that is pushing us towards a virtuous citizenry. I mean, that's first and foremost the way that we can have that, what Augustine called the tranquility of order.
It seems to me that if you're building up a just society that can protect itself, education is a national security issue, and the
Mm-hmm.
lack of virtue formation or virtue education of our youth, would be a threat to that. And I know, given your role at the victims of communism, what do you think about sort of the socialist and pro-Marxist ideas that have really gained appeal amongst the younger generations, and how does that and how can we make that more just in the future through education?
Yeah. So surveys going back 15 years now tell us that people under 40, between 26 and 38% of them, so almost 40%. And this goes back to about 2006, 2008. About a third of our young people who are now young adults like the idea of socialism. Well, let me tell you what Martin Luther King Jr. in a 1953 sermon, how he dissected communism and how it is incompatible with Christianity and incompatible with Western civilization. He said, this is what communism is. First, bad ideas. It is, he said, atheistic, secular, and materialistic. And if you think, the vast majority of Americans actually don't hold to that type of values, because even Americans who aren't very religious do believe in kind of a transcendent other, and they believe in the worth of the human person. We are not secular materialists in the way that the communists are. Second, he said, communism in all of its forms always seizes power and controls power through violence, lies, and murder. And you'll note whether it's Venezuela and its lefty leadership today, or the Soviets, or China today, or Cuba, there's no communist regime that came to power through the broad public accolades of the voting booth. In every case, it's been a revolutionary elite who seized power through violence and then imposed their will. And then King said, don't forget that in each of these regimes, a small elite keeps themselves in power. In other words, staying in power, the government itself becomes an end unto itself, not justice, not equality, not a better lifestyle. A small elite keeps themselves in power. They perpetuate the revolution, if you will. Well, if you think about those three ideas, and how many American young people have been sadly taught, American history is full of inequality. So what we ought to do is burn it all down and trust an idealistic or utopian elite to tell us how to build the new Jerusalem based on this kind of new atheistic, secular, materialist approach to life. It's very scary. We have mayoral candidates and state level candidates from California to New York running right now, for instance, for major city mayors in Minneapolis and New York City and things. It is very worrying. Of course, the way to inoculate America's young people from this is to start at the beginning with adequate moral training, adequate historical training, call out these lies from the very, very beginning. Sadly, we sent an entire generation of American young people into schools and situations that deconstructed the value structure of the Declaration of Independence and our Judeo-Christian heritage. We have to fight to get that back.
Man, I'm just thinking about a lot of the complaints you hear socially, politically, that this is the worst it's ever been. This is the sort of the end of history. Like we've got capitalism encroaching upon the ability for people to do well and to compete. And just the other day, I was listening to YouTube with my family, and I was talking. We were listening. It was We Didn't Start the Fire came on. Billy Joel. And that song really encompasses that every generation has a dumpster fire going on, and it's been going on since the fall of man. It's in our nature, and it's our job to educate our youth to learn something from the past and to teach. So how can investors get behind? Is there anything they can get behind that can help inoculate outside of just preaching these theoreticals about how we need to teach our kids? Like what should we be investing in to help inoculate the future?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the good news is that it has been worse at times in our country. We had a civil war that was very, very destructive, but it was caused by the great evil, first and foremost, of slavery, and then other things as well. But first and foremost, there would not have been the Civil War without the evil of slavery. I would say that that period in the late Vietnam War era, our country was being torn apart by a variety of things, and so we have weathered horrific storms to the body politic in a sense in the past. We can weather the current moment. The last few years have seemed very crazy, though. We've had a society where there's senior leaders who can't tell the difference between a boy and a girl. We've had people who've said one man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist, and they've specifically said George Washington is no different from a terrorist like Osama bin Laden or Che Guevara. So we've lived in a moment of a lack of moral absolutes that calls into question everything. The good news is, first of all, that truth is truth. And so the fundamentals from gravity to biology, etc., and moral truths about the difference between seeking justice versus kind of rapine, pillage, plunder type of approaches. I mean, there are differences here. In the corporate sector, I think first and foremost is just to deal with reality. To start with a sense of reality. I think there's been a lot of worry in the past decade about corporations through some DEI policies, some ESG policies moving out of bounds of reality. And let me give you one very specific example that I think is indisputable in the corporate sector in Europe. Europe, over the past 20 years, has been on this virtue signaling campaign about the climate, to the point where countries like Germany and France were willing to shut down their coal plants, shut down their refineries, seeking green energy. And here's the rub: they were willing to offshore their economic their energy security to places like Russia. So they allowed the Russians to drill for oil and pump the gas and then ship it to Europe. So corporations, these are decisions by publics and corporations and governments to reduce their own energy security, to put it in the hands of their historic enemy. Who's Germany's historic enemy? Russia. Russia's the country that attacks many of its neighbors or seeks to control them. But out of a crazy sense of unreality, to hand over their economic and their energy security to their mortal enemy, that's the kind of unreal and frankly unethical thinking that went on in Western Europe over the past 20 years. And look at the way that really came to hurt them at the beginning of the Ukraine war.
Well, there's one truth. There's not my truth, his truth. There's one reality, and it's our jobs as humans, as men, to learn about it, to figure it out, and to figure out how to make it better through our actions. And I really appreciate you joining us, your decades of scholarship, and just the moral clarity you bring and the practical wisdom to some of the hardest questions of our time. It's greatly appreciated, and I look forward to chatting with you again. Thank you, sir.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.